On April 20, 2005, a white Chevrolet Blazer moved slowly down an assembly line in Linden, New Jersey. It was not a glamorous car. It was not a futuristic prototype. It was not the kind of vehicle that usually gets remembered in the history books. But as it reached the end of the line, it carried something much heavier than its own steel body. It carried the end of automobile assembly in New Jersey. For 68 years, the General Motors plant in Linden had turned raw material, machinery and human labor into cars, trucks and even aircraft. It had built Buicks, Oldsmobiles, Pontiacs, Cadillacs, Chevrolets, GMCs, and wartime fighter planes. It had stood beside highways, rail lines, industrial yards, and the working neighborhoods that grew around the promise of steady wages. At its height, the plant was not just a workplace. It was a system, a rhythm, a place where generations punched in, learned skills, joined unions, raised families, and measured time by shifts, model years, contract negotiations, layoffs, recalls, retirements, and the sound of another vehicle leaving the line. Then the line stopped. There was no grand national ceremony. No monument rose overnight. Workers gathered, told stories, and faced the strange silence that follows when a place built for motion finally has nothing left to assemble. The question is not simply why Linden Assembly closed. The deeper question is how a plant that once represented the strength of American mass production became vulnerable to the very forces that mass production helped create. Linden Assembly opened in 1937 at a moment when General Motors was not just building cars. It was building a map of industrial America. The logic was simple but powerful. The automobile was becoming central to modern life, and the company needed plants close to major markets. Cars had to move from factories to dealerships, from rail yards to city streets, from assembly lines to middle-class driveways. Linden, positioned in northern New Jersey near New York, near ports, near rail routes, and near a dense consumer market, fit that strategy. The plant was part of General Motors' branch assembly system. Instead of concentrating all production in one distant manufacturing heartland, GM spread assembly capacity across major metropolitan regions. This allowed the company to serve different markets more efficiently and to build multiple divisions into a nationwide industrial empire. Linden was not a small workshop. It was a vast industrial complex covering millions of square feet. Inside, Buick, Oldsmobile, and Pontiac vehicles moved through an organized sequence of operations. Bodies arrived, frames moved, engines were fitted, trim was installed, paint dried. Workers repeated precise tasks thousands of times until individual pieces became a finished automobile. This was the genius of the American assembly plant. It broke complexity into routine. It turned scale into power. It allowed a company to produce not one handmade machine for one wealthy buyer, but thousands of vehicles for a country reorganizing itself around roads, suburbs, commuting, and personal mobility. But a factory like Linden did more than build cars. It built dependability into local life. A job at a major auto plant could become the center of a household economy. It could pay a mortgage. It could support children. It could sustain diners, shops, bars, schools, and local tax bases. The factory whistle did not stop at the factory gate. Its schedule spread into the city around it. For Linden, General Motors became part of the landscape. The plant was not hidden away. It was visible, physical, and massive. It sat as proof that industrial America was not an abstraction. It was concrete floors, steel columns, loading docks, tool rooms, oil sparks, and thousands of people moving through the same gates. In those early years, the factory reflected confidence. The country wanted cars. General Motors knew how to produce them. Linden had a place in that system. Then war interrupted the assembly line. When the United States entered the Second World War, factories across the country were asked to do something extraordinary. They had to stop making products for civilian life and begin making machines for survival. Linden was transformed. The plant that had been built to assemble cars was converted into part of General Motors' Eastern Aircraft Division. Instead of sending automobiles to showrooms, workers helped produce military aircraft for the Navy. The change was not cosmetic. Aircraft production required new tolerances, new methods, new training, new urgency, and a different understanding of what industrial labor meant. The factory's machines, workers, and systems were redirected toward the Grumman Wildcat program. The Wildcat was a carrier-based fighter, a compact and rugged aircraft associated with the early years of the Pacific War. In Linden, the industrial culture of automobile assembly was pushed into aviation. Workers accustomed to doors, fenders, frames, and trim had to adapt to wings, fuselages, control surfaces, and military inspection standards. This chapter matters because it reveals something important about Linden's identity. The plant was not just a building. It was adaptable capacity. It was a national resource. In peacetime, it could build vehicles for families and businesses. In wartime, it could be turned toward combat aircraft. That ability to convert civilian manufacturing into military production became one of the defining claims of American industry in the 20th century. The same mass production logic that filled dealerships could also supply war fronts. The workers were part of that conversion. They were not simply pressing buttons on machines. They were learning, adjusting, and carrying the pressure of a world conflict into their daily routine. Every aircraft component moved through the factory with a different kind of weight. A mistake on an automobile might become a warranty issue. A mistake on a fighter plane could become a matter of life and death. When the war ended, Linden returned to automobile production. But the plant had been marked by the experience. It had proven that it could serve the country in more than one way. That is why the later silence of the factory feels so heavy. Linden was not a marginal site with a minor role. It had been part of the nation's manufacturing strength in both peace and war. After the war, America entered the long automobile age. The country expanded outward. Highways stretched across the landscape. Suburbs grew. Families bought second cars. The automobile became a symbol of independence, status, and belonging. General Motors stood near the center of that world, and plants like Linden helped supply it. To understand Linden Assembly, it is not enough to list the vehicles. You have to imagine the repetition of daily life around the plant. Early mornings, lunch pails, work boots, parking lots filling before sunrise, union meetings, overtime, paychecks, the smell of paint and metal, the sound of compressed air, workers learning the language of the line, tact, trim, chassis, body shop, final inspection. A plant like Linden created a community inside the walls. People spent decades beside the same co-workers. They watched younger employees arrive and older workers retire. They knew who was saving for a house, who had a child in college, who was close to 30 years, who was worried about the next round of layoffs. The assembly line could be exhausting. It was repetitive, physical, and unforgiving, but it also created bonds. Workers understood each other through shared strain. They knew what it meant to keep pace with a line that did not care whether your back hurt or your hands were tired. They knew the pride of seeing a finished vehicle leave the plant and knowing that some part of it had passed through their station. This was the human side of industrial scale. For the city, the plant meant employment, tax revenue, and identity. For families, it meant a route into the middle class. For workers, it meant a life structured by labor but also protected, at least for a time, by union strength and industrial demand. The factory became a bridge between individual effort and national prosperity. A worker did not need to own the corporation to feel part of something large. The product moved through the world. A car built in Linden might appear on a highway hundreds of miles away. A family might drive it to work, to school, to church, to the shore, to another state. The factory's labor disappeared into ordinary American life. That was the power of the place. And because the plant gave so much structure to life, its decline would not feel like the loss of one employer. It would feel like the weakening of a whole social contract. By the 1970s and early 1980s, Linden Assembly had become part of a different General Motors. The post-war boom was aging. Competition was growing. Fuel crises, emissions rules, changing consumer expectations, and new imported vehicles were reshaping the American car market. But GM still possessed enormous scale, and Linden continued to receive important work. The plant produced some of the company's most recognizable divisions and models. Buick, Oldsmobile, Pontiac, and Cadillac were not just names on cars. They were social markers. Each brand carried a different promise. Buick suggested quiet success. Oldsmobile balanced comfort and engineering ambition. Pontiac leaned toward excitement and performance. Cadillac represented prestige. For Linden to build vehicles from these divisions meant the plant was deeply embedded in GM's old brand ladder. the system that encouraged buyers to move upward through the corporation over a lifetime. A customer might begin with a modest Chevrolet, graduate to a Pontiac, move into an Oldsmobile or Buick, and one day reach Cadillac. The corporation sold not only transportation, but aspiration. Linden helped make that aspiration physical. Yet inside this confidence was a structural problem. The very system that made GM powerful also made it complex. Multiple brands, overlapping platforms, large plants, union obligations, older facilities, and enormous fixed costs created a machine that required constant volume. When demand was strong, the system looked almost unbeatable. When demand weakened, the burden of scale became harder to carry. Factories like Linden were designed for throughput. They needed models that sold in sufficient numbers. They needed steady programs, investment, and a reason to keep the line running. A large plant cannot easily survive on nostalgia. It needs product. That is one of the central tensions in the Linden story. The factory had history, skill, and identity. But in the modern auto industry, history does not guarantee allocation. A plant lives or dies by the next vehicle assigned to it. When the product plan changes, the fate of thousands can shift in a boardroom far from the city whose name is on the plant. In the early 1990s, Linden underwent a major transformation. The plant was idled and retooled for truck and sport utility vehicle production. This was not just a technical change. It was a sign of where the American market was going. The old passenger car programs were no longer enough. Consumers were moving toward trucks, SUVs, and vehicles that promised utility, height, power, and a different kind of personal freedom. The suburban driveway was changing. The family car was no longer always a sedan. The sport utility vehicle was becoming a cultural object. Linden was assigned products that seemed to fit the moment. The Chevrolet S10 pickup, GMC Sonoma, Chevrolet Blazer, and GMC Jimmy on paper. This gave the plant a future. It connected Linden to one of the strongest trends in the American market. SUVs were rising. Trucks were profitable. GM had long experience in both categories. Retooling the plant suggested that the old factory could still adapt. But adaptation is not the same as security. The vehicles Linden built in the 1990s belonged to a competitive and fast-changing segment. The Blazer and Jimmy had name recognition, but the market did not stand still. Newer SUVs arrived. Customers expected more refinement, better interiors, improved safety, stronger reliability, and more modern designs. Competitors moved quickly. Even within GM, newer vehicles began to overlap with the older models. A plant can be saved by a new assignment. It can also be trapped by one. If the assigned vehicle ages, the plant ages with it. If the model loses demand, the workers feel the decline first through reduced shifts, layoffs, and rumors. The machinery may still function. The workforce may still be skilled. But if the product no longer has a strong market, the line becomes vulnerable. That is what began to happen in Linden. The SUV that once looked like a lifeline slowly became a warning sign. By the early 2000s, the signals were becoming harder to ignore. Sales of the Chevrolet Blazer and GMC Jimmy were weakening. The models were aging. GM had newer sport utility vehicles in the market. Demand no longer justified the same production volume. In 2002, Linden lost a shift, and many workers lost the future they thought they still had. A shift cut is not only an operational decision. In a factory town, it is a message. It tells workers that the company is no longer trying to grow the plant. It tells suppliers to expect less. It tells families to prepare. It tells younger employees to wonder whether they should transfer, wait, or leave. It tells older employees to count the years until retirement with new urgency. The official language of closure is usually careful. Companies speak of market demand, capacity, competitiveness, production alignment, and restructuring. Those words are not meaningless. They describe real pressures, but they do not capture what happens in a household when a paycheck is threatened. For Linden, the problem was layered. The Blazer and Jimmy were no longer strong enough to carry the plant. The facility was old. Its location was not ideal for the supplier geography of the modern auto industry. GM's market share was under pressure. The corporation was trying to rationalize capacity across North America. A large plant with aging products became difficult to defend. That does not mean the workforce failed. This is one of the most important points in the Linden story. Industrial decline is often explained as if workers simply stopped being good enough. But the evidence points to a broader structure: changing demand, product timing, plant economics, corporate strategy, and the geography of supply chains. The people on the line could still build vehicles. The question was whether GM still had a reason to build those vehicles there. By 2004 and 2005, the answer was becoming clear. Linden was approaching the end. Factories often look permanent from the outside. Their walls are thick. Their floors are reinforced. Their machinery is heavy. They occupy so much land that it feels impossible for them to disappear. A place like Linden Assembly seemed less like a business unit than a feature of the landscape. But the strength of an industrial plant can hide its weakness. A huge factory carries huge obligations. It needs maintenance, modernization, logistics, energy, environmental compliance, and a steady product stream. Its advantages are real only when the system around it supports them. When the market shifts, the same size that once made it powerful can make it expensive. Linden was built for an earlier manufacturing geography. It belonged to a time when major plants near major markets made deep strategic sense. But by the late 20th century, the auto industry was reorganizing. Supply chains became more integrated, more time-sensitive, and more geographically concentrated around different production corridors. Plants were compared not only by skill or history, but by cost, flexibility, logistics, and future product allocation. The old moral argument for keeping a plant open because workers had served loyally, because the city depended on it, because generations had given their lives to the line was powerful emotionally, but weak in corporate arithmetic. This is the tragedy of many industrial closures. The factory matters most to the people nearest to it, but the decision is often made according to a map much larger than the town. Linden's decline was not a sudden collapse. It was a narrowing of options. First the product aged, then volume fell, then shifts were cut, then the plant waited for a future assignment that never came. The facility still had history, but history could not be bolted onto the next vehicle platform. The most painful part was that the closure was understandable and devastating at the same time. The business logic could be explained. The human loss still remained. When the final white Blazer came off the line, the end was quiet but immense. The last vehicle was more than a product. It was a marker. It marked the end of 68 years of manufacturing at Linden. It marked the end of New Jersey's remaining auto assembly era. It marked the end of a workplace where people had spent not just years, but identities. Workers did what workers often do at the end of a plant. They gathered. They told stories. They remembered the old line, the old supervisors, the old models, the old jokes, the old grievances, the people who had retired, the people who had passed away, the people who had transferred, the people who never thought the plant would close. There is a particular grief that comes with losing a factory. It is not only unemployment. Some workers retire, some transfer, some find other jobs, some adjust. But even when individuals survive economically, something collective disappears. A factory is a memory machine. Every corner holds a time period. A certain door belongs to the 1970s. A certain brake area belongs to a group of workers from the 1980s. A certain line speed recalls a difficult model launch. A certain parking lot holds the tension of a strike. A layoff notice, a first day, a last day. When the plant closes, those memories lose their physical anchor. The building may still stand for a while, but its meaning changes. Gates are locked. Weeds appear. Security guards replace shift changes. The line that once demanded constant motion becomes still. A place built to produce begins to decay. For a worker who spent decades there, silence is not empty. It is crowded with everything that used to happen. And then in Linden, even the building began to disappear. After the closure, the former GM site entered a new phase. The old plant was sold, cleared, and redeveloped. What had once been an automobile assembly complex became part of a modern logistics and commercial landscape. Warehouses and distribution facilities replaced the old line. The site was reimagined for another economy. Not one centered on assembling cars, but one centered on moving goods through dense consumer markets. This is not a simple story of ruin. Redevelopment can bring jobs. It can return land to use. It can clean up contaminated industrial property. It can generate tax revenue. It can prevent a dead factory from becoming a permanent scar, but the replacement also reveals what changed. The old factory took parts and labor and produced finished vehicles. The new economy often takes packages, inventory, data, and transportation networks and moves goods through space at high speed. Both are industrial in a broad sense. Both require workers. Both depend on infrastructure. But they do not mean the same thing to a community. An auto assembly plant created a particular kind of working-class identity. It required deep coordination, specialized production knowledge, union structures, and long-term attachment. A logistics complex belongs to a more fluid economy, one organized around distribution, consumption, and speed. The name legacy is appropriate because the site carries layers of memory. Beneath the modern buildings is the ghost of another system. Beneath the truck bays and warehouse floors is the memory of Buicks, Pontiacs, Oldsmobiles, Cadillacs, Blazers, Jimmies, and Wildcats. Beneath the new traffic patterns is the older rhythm of a plant that once defined the working day for thousands. The story of Linden Assembly still matters because it refuses easy answers. It was not simply destroyed by foreign competition. It was not simply killed by executives. It was not simply outdated because workers failed to adapt. It declined because industrial systems are fragile when products, markets, costs, and corporate priorities no longer align. The plant rose because it fit the world around it. It disappeared because that world changed, and that is what makes its story so powerful. Linden Assembly was not an accident of history. It was one of the places where modern America was made, where cars became ordinary, where wartime production became possible, where industrial wages supported families, where the promise of steady work felt real. When the last Blazer left the line, it did not erase that past. It exposed how much of it had already been slipping away. Today, most people passing the old site may not hear the assembly line. They may see warehouses, trucks, stores, roads, and ordinary commercial activity. But for those who remember, the place still contains another sound. The echo of metal moving through a plant that once helped build an automobile state, a wartime arsenal, and a working-class life. And the deeper question remains, when a factory like Linden disappears, what exactly has been lost? A building, a company asset, a product line, or a whole way of believing that work, place, and future could belong together? If you enjoyed this story and want more documentaries about the factories, industries, and forgotten companies that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support would be much appreciated.